Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most famous disaster stories ever written, the plagues of Egypt. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's mystery together. Long before historians, archaeologists, and scientists started arguing about environmental disasters and ancient climate events, there was simply the story. And it is not a subtle one. The 10 plagues of Egypt appear in the book of Exodus and form one of the most dramatic sequences in the entire Bible. Even people who have never opened the text usually know at least a few of the highlights. Rivers turning to blood, frogs absolutely everywhere, swarms of insects, livestock dying, a sky that suddenly goes dark for 3 days, and finally, a mysterious final plague that convinces Pharaoh that maybe keeping millions of angry slaves was not the best management strategy. According to the biblical narrative, it all begins when Moses confronts Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, with a fairly straightforward request. Let the Israelites go. Pharaoh refuses, which, according to the story, turns out to be a spectacularly bad decision, because what follows is essentially a series of escalating disasters that make Egypt look less like the most powerful civilization in the ancient world, and more like the setting of a very unfortunate nature documentary. First, the Nile turns to blood. Now, the Nile was not just a river to the Egyptians, it was the entire foundation of their civilization. It provided water, irrigation, transportation, fish, trade routes, and probably most of their daily patience. So when that river suddenly becomes undrinkable and full of dead fish, things go downhill very quickly. Then come the frogs. Lots of frogs. The text describes them appearing everywhere. Houses, kitchens, bedrooms, ovens. Which means the ancient Egyptians briefly experienced something similar to a biblical version of a plumbing disaster. Once the frogs die, things get worse. Because now you have rotting animals everywhere, which attracts insects. Swarms of gnats and flies appear, livestock begin dying, and people develop painful boils. Then the sky decides to get involved. A violent hailstorm destroys crops. Locusts arrive to eat whatever survived the hail, and at one point the land is covered in darkness for 3 days. At this stage, Egypt is essentially dealing with the ancient equivalent of a cascading environmental meltdown. And then comes the final plague, the death of the firstborn. It is the moment that finally breaks Pharaoh's resistance and leads to the Exodus. For thousands of years, believers have read this story as divine intervention. But modern historians and scientists sometimes look at it and think something slightly different. That is an awful lot of disasters, occurring in a very suspicious sequence, and that raises a curious possibility. What if the story is remembering real events? Not miracles necessarily, but a chain reaction of catastrophes that ancient people tried to explain the only way they could. Now here is where historians run into their first problem. The story of the plagues is incredibly famous, but finding historical evidence for it is complicated. Because when people imagine ancient Egypt, they often picture a civilization that recorded everything. Temples covered in hieroglyphs. Papyrus scrolls filled with detailed accounts of kings, battles, and daily life. And that image is mostly accurate. Ancient Egypt produced a massive amount of written material. Pharaohs loved documenting their victories, their building projects, and the many ways the gods clearly approved of their leadership. What they did not enjoy documenting was failure, or disasters, or national embarrassment. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions were not written as objective history. They were royal propaganda. Their purpose was to glorify the pharaoh and demonstrate that Egypt was stable, prosperous, and favoured by the gods. Which means if something truly catastrophic happened, it probably would not appear on temple walls. Imagine a modern government proudly publishing an official monument that says, "In the 10th year of Pharaoh's reign, the river turned into a biological nightmare. Frogs invaded every kitchen, insects filled the air, crops were destroyed, and then everyone panicked." That monument probably would not make it past the approval committee. So historians face a strange situation. If the plagues were purely religious storytelling, we would not expect to find evidence. But if something like them actually happened, Egypt might still have chosen not to record it. That means researchers have to look in unusual places. Indirect evidence, environmental clues, ancient documents that describe chaos rather than royal victories. And occasionally, historians stumble across texts that sound strangely familiar. One of the most famous examples is something called the Ipuwer Papyrus. This ancient Egyptian text describes a time when the land was filled with disorder. Social order collapses. The poor rise up. Death spreads through the population. And one particular line catches everyone's attention. It describes the river as blood. Now historians immediately raise their eyebrows at that sentence. Not because it proves the biblical story happened, but because it suggests that ancient Egyptians themselves remembered periods when things went terribly wrong. And when historians see ancient texts describing rivers of blood, societal collapse, and widespread disaster, they begin asking questions. Because sometimes history does not disappear completely. Sometimes it survives as fragments of memory, even if those memories are a little dramatic. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence often mentioned in discussions about the biblical plagues is a document known as the Ipuwer Papyrus. The name sounds mysterious, but the document itself is essentially an ancient Egyptian text describing a period of chaos and social collapse. It is sometimes called the Admonitions of Ipuwer, and it reads less like a calm historical report and more like someone describing a society that has completely fallen apart, which, as you might imagine, immediately caught the attention of historians. The papyrus was discovered in the 19th century and is currently housed in a museum in the Netherlands. The text itself appears to have been copied during the New Kingdom period, but scholars believe the original composition may be much older, and the descriptions inside it are dramatic. The writer laments that the land is in chaos. Social order has broken down. Servants have become masters. The wealthy are suffering while the poor have taken their place. Violence and disorder seem to spread everywhere. But the line that usually gets the most attention is this one: "The river is blood." Now, if that phrase sounds familiar, it is because it resembles the first plague described in Exodus. Naturally, this similarity has led some people to wonder whether the Ipuwer Papyrus might be describing the same events. But historians immediately urge caution. The text is poetic and symbolic. Ancient Egyptian literature often used dramatic imagery to describe political or social upheaval. When a writer says the river is blood, it might not mean the Nile literally turned red. It might simply be a metaphor for chaos or violence. And there is another complication. Dating the text precisely is difficult. Scholars disagree about when the original story was composed, and the surviving copy was written centuries later. So while the Ipuwer Papyrus is fascinating, it cannot be treated as direct proof of the biblical plagues. Still, it raises an interesting possibility. Ancient Egyptians themselves remembered periods of turmoil and disaster, and sometimes those memories appear in strange ways within ancient texts. The real question is not whether the Ipuwer Papyrus proves the Exodus story. It does not. The real question is something slightly more subtle. Could stories like the plagues have grown from memories of real catastrophes, that ancient people struggled to explain? Because when natural disasters strike ancient societies, they rarely get recorded as calm scientific observations. They get recorded as stories, and those stories often survive far longer than the disasters themselves. If historians try to look for natural explanations behind the plagues, the first place they usually start is with the Nile. Because if something went wrong with the Nile, everything in Egypt would go wrong immediately afterward. Ancient Egyptian civilization depended on that river more than almost any other society depended on a single natural resource. The Nile provided water, irrigation for crops, transportation routes, fish for food, and the annual flooding that made agriculture possible. If the Nile failed, Egypt failed. So when the book of Exodus begins its list of plagues with the Nile turning to blood, scientists immediately start asking what kind of environmental event could produce something like that. Now, to be clear, no river literally turns into blood. If that happened today, scientists would be less concerned with algae and more concerned with the apocalypse. But rivers can turn red. One possible explanation is something called a harmful algal bloom. Certain microorganisms can multiply rapidly under the right environmental conditions, especially when water becomes warmer or contaminated with nutrients. Some species produce pigments that turn the water deep red or reddish-brown, and many of them produce toxins. When these blooms occur, fish die in huge numbers because the water becomes depleted of oxygen. The river can become foul-smelling, undrinkable, and dangerous for animals and humans alike. To ancient observers, the effect would have been terrifying. Imagine waking up to find that the river your entire civilization depends on has suddenly changed colour. Fish are floating dead along the banks, and the water smells so bad no one wants to drink it. You might not immediately think algal bloom. You might think something far more dramatic. And if the Nile became polluted or toxic, it would trigger a cascade of consequences across the ecosystem. Fish would die. Animals that lived in the water would flee. And suddenly, creatures that normally stayed hidden inside the river would begin appearing everywhere else. Which leads directly to the second plague, the frogs. And once frogs start fleeing the river in massive numbers, the entire chain reaction of environmental chaos might already be underway, because ecosystems have a habit of collapsing in very inconvenient ways, especially when their main river suddenly stops cooperating. If the Nile really did become polluted or toxic for some reason, the next plague described in Exodus suddenly starts to make a surprising amount of sense. Frogs. A lot of frogs. According to the biblical account, frogs poured out of the river and spread across the land. They filled homes, kitchens, ovens, and sleeping areas. Basically, anywhere an ancient Egyptian might reasonably expect not to find frogs. There were frogs, which must have made daily life extremely awkward. But amphibians behave in very predictable ways when their environment becomes dangerous. Frogs spend most of their lives in or near water. Their skin is highly sensitive to toxins, oxygen levels, and pollution. If the water becomes contaminated, they are often among the first creatures to abandon it. So if something made the Nile suddenly toxic, frogs would not politely stay where they were. They would leave, quickly, and they would leave in enormous numbers. Modern ecological disasters sometimes show exactly this behaviour. When wetlands or rivers become polluted, amphibians flee the water and spread across nearby land as they search for safer environments. To the people watching this happen in ancient Egypt, the result would look like a full-scale frog invasion. But there is another important detail. Frogs do not survive long away from water. So if huge numbers of frogs escaped the river and spread across the countryside, many of them would soon begin dying. Which brings us to the next part of the ecological domino effect. Dead animals. And lots of them. Once frogs die in large numbers, their bodies begin decomposing, and decomposition attracts something that ancient people probably disliked even more than frogs: insects. Rotting organic matter is basically an invitation for flies, gnats, and other insects to reproduce rapidly. Their populations can explode in a very short time, when food sources suddenly appear everywhere. So the frog invasion might have been only the beginning. First the river becomes toxic, then frogs flee the water, then frogs die across the land. And suddenly Egypt is dealing with something much worse than amphibians. Because when insect populations explode, they bring more than annoyance. They bring disease. And the next plagues described in Exodus involve exactly that: swarms of insects filling the air, which suggests that the environmental chain reaction might have already been in full motion. Once large numbers of frogs die across the countryside, the ecological situation begins to change rapidly. Because nature has a very efficient cleanup crew: insects. When organic matter begins decomposing, flies, gnats, mosquitoes, and other insects multiply extremely quickly. Their life cycles are short, which means their populations can explode in just a few days if conditions are right. And if thousands of frogs suddenly died across the Nile Valley, conditions would definitely be right. The book of Exodus describes 2 plagues that involve insects. First comes lice or gnats, then comes swarms of flies. To ancient people, these would have seemed like 2 separate supernatural punishments. But from an ecological perspective, they might simply represent different stages of the same outbreak. Gnats and biting insects often breed in damp soil, stagnant water, or decaying organic matter. If the Nile ecosystem had been disrupted and amphibians were dying across the land, insect populations would likely rise very quickly. And once insects begin multiplying, they bring another problem with them: disease. Many insects are vectors for bacteria and parasites. They can carry pathogens from animal carcasses to livestock, crops, and humans. Modern epidemiology has shown how quickly insect-borne diseases can spread in environments where sanitation breaks down. Ancient Egypt would have been especially vulnerable. The Nile Valley was densely populated. People lived close to their animals. Water sources were shared by humans, livestock, and wildlife. If insects carrying bacteria suddenly became widespread, outbreaks of disease could follow. The biblical sequence actually reflects this possibility quite closely. After the swarms of insects come plagues affecting livestock. Then painful boils appear among humans and animals. To modern scientists, that progression looks less like separate supernatural events and more like a cascade of biological consequences. First insects spread, then infections spread. And once disease begins moving through animal populations, the entire agricultural system starts to suffer. Livestock provide milk, meat, transportation, and farming power. If animals begin dying in large numbers, food production collapses. And that kind of collapse can quickly turn environmental disruption into a full-scale societal crisis. To ancient Egyptians watching these events unfold, the situation would have seemed terrifying. Because the disasters were not stopping, each problem seemed to trigger another one. And the next stage of the plagues would make the situation even worse. Because now the diseases begin killing the animals that Egypt depended on most. After the swarms of insects come one of the most economically devastating plagues described in Exodus: the death of livestock. According to the biblical account, horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats across Egypt begin dying in large numbers. For an ancient agricultural society, this would have been more than a tragedy. It would have been a disaster for the entire economy. Livestock were not just food in ancient Egypt. They were transportation, farming equipment, fertilizer, milk production, leather, wool, and wealth, all wrapped into one very useful animal. So, when the Bible describes livestock dying across the land, historians immediately start wondering what kind of disease might cause something like that. And once again, the previous plagues may offer a clue. If insect populations exploded because of decaying animals and environmental disruption, those insects could easily spread bacteria and viruses between animals. Modern veterinary science shows that insect-borne diseases can spread rapidly through herds. One possible candidate often mentioned is anthrax. Anthrax bacteria live in soil and can infect grazing animals such as cattle and sheep. Insects that feed on infected animals can carry the bacteria to other livestock, spreading the disease quickly. Anthrax infections can kill animals very suddenly, sometimes within a day or two. To ancient observers, this would look terrifyingly mysterious. Healthy animals would suddenly collapse and die with little warning, and once large numbers of livestock begin dying, the consequences ripple outward across the entire society. Farmers lose their ploughing animals, milk production drops, food supplies shrink, trade suffers, and worst of all, diseases affecting animals can sometimes spread to humans as well. Which brings us to the next plague described in Exodus, boils. Painful skin sores appearing on both people and animals. Now, if you are noticing that each plague seems to logically follow the previous one, you are not alone. Some scientists believe the biblical sequence may actually preserve a surprisingly accurate description of how environmental disasters cascade through ecosystems. One problem leads to another, which leads to another, until an entire civilization is dealing with multiple crises at the same time. And Egypt, already weakened by ecological collapse and disease, was about to face something even worse, a storm powerful enough to destroy the country's crops. After livestock begin dying across the countryside, the biblical narrative describes another disturbing development. Painful boils appear on both humans and animals. Now, at first glance, this plague seems different from the previous ones. Turning water red, frogs fleeing the river, insect swarms, livestock disease. Those events can all be connected through environmental chain reactions. But boils? That sounds more like a medical mystery. However, when scientists look at ecosystems under stress, the appearance of skin diseases actually fits surprisingly well into the pattern we have already been discussing. Because when insect populations explode and animal diseases spread, humans often become the next victims. Insects, such as flies, mosquitoes, and biting gnats, are extremely effective carriers of bacteria. They feed on infected animals and then move to new hosts, spreading pathogens from one organism to another. If Egypt had been dealing with massive insect swarms following widespread animal deaths, the conditions would have been perfect for infectious disease outbreaks. Some researchers have suggested that illnesses like anthrax, glanders, or other bacterial infections could produce symptoms similar to the boils described in Exodus. Anthrax, for example, can cause severe skin lesions in humans known as cutaneous anthrax. These infections begin as small sores, but can quickly become painful blackened wounds. To ancient people with no understanding of bacteria, such symptoms would have appeared terrifying and inexplicable. Imagine living in a society where the river has already failed, animals are dying across farms, insects fill the air, and now painful sores are appearing on people's bodies. At this point, the situation would have felt less like a series of random events and more like the world itself turning against you. And from a psychological perspective, that matters. Ancient societies interpreted disasters through religious and spiritual frameworks. When multiple crises occurred in rapid succession, people often believed divine forces were responsible. So if Egyptians were witnessing disease spreading among animals and humans at the same time as ecological collapse, they may have interpreted it as divine punishment. But the disasters were not finished. Because after disease weakens an agricultural society, the next major threat becomes something even more destructive: weather. And according to the biblical account, the next plague brought one of the most violent storms Egypt had ever seen. A storm that destroyed crops, shattered trees, and made the crisis even worse. By the time the story reaches the seventh plague, Egypt is already having a very bad year. The river has failed. Frogs have invaded the countryside. Insects are everywhere. Livestock are dying. Disease is spreading among people. At this point, most ancient civilizations would already be struggling. But according to the book of Exodus, the disasters are not finished. Next comes a violent storm unlike anything Egypt had seen before. The text describes thunder, lightning, and hail falling from the sky, with enough force to destroy crops, break trees, and kill animals caught outside. For ancient Egyptians, this would have been especially shocking. Because severe hailstorms are extremely rare in Egypt, the Nile Valley has a hot, dry climate, and while storms do occur, large hail is unusual. So if a particularly intense storm system formed, it would have seemed extraordinary. Modern meteorology offers a possible explanation. Under certain atmospheric conditions, powerful storms can form even in regions where they are normally uncommon. When warm air near the ground rises rapidly into colder air above, massive storm clouds can develop. Inside those clouds, water droplets are carried upward repeatedly by strong updrafts, freezing into ice and growing larger each time they cycle through the storm. Eventually, the ice becomes too heavy to remain suspended, and hail begins falling. If such a storm struck agricultural areas already weakened by earlier disasters, the consequences would be severe. Crops that had survived disease and environmental disruption would suddenly be destroyed. Trees could be damaged. Fields flattened. In an ancient society dependent on yearly harvests, this kind of storm could create widespread food shortages almost overnight. But the biblical sequence suggests something even worse happened next. After the hailstorm passed, the land was left vulnerable. The crops that remained were already damaged, and damaged crops attract a particular type of visitor: locusts. Now, locust swarms are one of the most destructive natural events recorded in agricultural history. A large swarm can contain billions of insects and travel hundreds of kilometers in search of food. When they arrive, they eat everything: leaves, stems, grain, even bark. So if Egypt had already suffered ecological collapse, disease, and crop damage from storms, the arrival of a locust swarm would not just be another inconvenience, it would be catastrophic. Because once the locusts arrive, the food supply disappears almost completely. After the hailstorm destroys much of Egypt's crops, the book of Exodus describes the next disaster arriving almost immediately: locusts. And if you have never seen a locust swarm in real life, it is difficult to imagine how destructive they can be. Locusts are not just ordinary grasshoppers. Under certain environmental conditions, these insects change behavior. They gather in enormous groups and enter what scientists call the gregarious phase, forming massive swarms that move across entire regions. A single swarm can contain tens of billions of insects. Yes, billions. And every one of them is hungry. When locust swarms land on farmland, they consume almost everything green. Crops disappear. Leaves vanish from trees. Even the bark of plants can be stripped away. Modern locust swarms in Africa and the Middle East have devastated agriculture within hours. So, when Exodus describes locusts devouring whatever remained after the hailstorm, historians and scientists nod slightly, because that is exactly what locusts do. If Egyptian crops were already weakened by earlier disasters, the fields would have been extremely vulnerable, and locusts are remarkably good at finding struggling farmland. Wind patterns can carry swarms hundreds of kilometers. They often appear suddenly, covering the sky like a moving cloud. Ancient writers sometimes describe the sun being darkened by locusts in flight. To people witnessing this thousands of years ago, the experience would have been overwhelming. Imagine standing in your fields watching the sky fill with insects. Then they land. And within hours, the crops you depended on for the entire year are gone. Grain, vegetables, fruit trees, everything. For a civilization whose stability depended on predictable harvests, this kind of disaster could create immediate famine conditions. And when food supplies collapse, societies begin to panic. The biblical account suggests Egypt was now facing exactly that situation. The Nile had already failed. Animals were dying. Disease was spreading. Storms had destroyed crops. And now locusts had eaten what little remained. At this point, Egypt was no longer dealing with a single disaster. It was experiencing what scientists call a cascade failure, one crisis triggering the next. And according to the story, the next plague would be one of the most mysterious of all. 3 days of darkness. After rivers fail, animals die, crops are destroyed, and locusts eat whatever survives, the biblical narrative introduces one of the strangest plagues of all: darkness. Not ordinary nighttime darkness, but 3 full days in which, according to the book of Exodus, the land of Egypt was covered in such thick darkness that people could not see one another or leave their homes. That description has puzzled historians for centuries, because darkness lasting that long is not something that normally happens in the Nile Valley. But scientists studying ancient environmental disasters have suggested a few possible explanations. One of the most discussed involves volcanic eruptions. Around the time many scholars place the Exodus story, the Mediterranean world experienced one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history, the eruption of Thera on the island of Santorini. This massive volcanic explosion sent ash and debris high into the atmosphere and spread volcanic material across huge areas of the eastern Mediterranean. Ash clouds from eruptions can travel hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. When they do, they can block sunlight and create eerie dark skies over distant regions. Even far from the eruption itself, the atmosphere can become hazy, dim, and unsettling. Ancient people witnessing such conditions would have had no scientific explanation. To them, the sun itself might appear to disappear. Another possible explanation involves massive sandstorms. Egypt sometimes experiences powerful desert storms known as Khamsin winds, which can fill the air with thick clouds of dust. These storms can darken the sky dramatically, reducing visibility and turning daylight into an eerie twilight. In extreme cases, the air can become so filled with dust that breathing becomes difficult and people remain indoors. Now imagine such a storm occurring after a series of other disasters. Crops gone, animals dead, insects everywhere, disease spreading, and suddenly the sky itself turns dark. At that point, ancient Egyptians might not have seen it as a weather event. They might have believed the entire natural world was turning against them. But according to the biblical narrative, even this terrifying darkness was not the final disaster. One more plague remained, and it would become the most haunting and mysterious of them all: the death of the firstborn. After 9 disasters, the book of Exodus describes the final and most terrifying plague, the death of the firstborn. According to the biblical narrative, during a single night the firstborn child in every Egyptian household died. The text describes grief spreading across the land as families discovered that their eldest sons had suddenly perished. This is the moment that finally breaks Pharaoh's resistance. After this plague, he allows the Israelites to leave Egypt. For historians, however, this plague is the most difficult to explain. Many of the earlier plagues can be connected to environmental chain reactions, polluted water, insect outbreaks, disease among animals, agricultural collapse, and unusual weather events. But the death of the firstborn? That is harder. Some researchers have proposed a theory involving toxic grain. If Egypt had suffered ecological disasters, crop damage, and poor storage conditions, certain types of fungi could grow on stored grain. Some of these fungi produce powerful toxins. One example is ergot fungus, which can contaminate cereal grains under humid conditions. Another possibility involves molds that produce poisonous compounds, capable of causing severe illness or death. Now imagine a famine situation. Food is scarce. Families rely heavily on whatever grain remains in storage. In many ancient households, the eldest family members or the heads of households often received the first portion of food, which might mean they would consume the largest quantities of contaminated grain. That could create a pattern where the firstborn sons or leading family members were affected first. But historians are careful here. There is no direct evidence proving that something like this occurred in Egypt during the time traditionally associated with the Exodus. The theory simply shows how environmental disasters could potentially lead to unusual patterns of illness. Another possibility is that the final plague represents symbolic storytelling rather than a literal event. Ancient texts often use powerful narrative elements to emphasize the climax of a story. In this interpretation, the death of the firstborn symbolizes the final collapse of Pharaoh's power and the ultimate judgment against Egypt. So while earlier plagues might reflect memories of real disasters, the final plague could have been shaped by centuries of religious storytelling. And that raises an important point. Ancient stories often preserve fragments of real events, but over time those events are retold, interpreted, and transformed into something much larger than the original experience. Which means the real mystery of the plagues may not be whether they happened exactly as written, but whether ancient people were remembering a catastrophe that history only partially remembers today. When historians examine ancient texts like the Book of Exodus, they often ask a different question than the one most people expect. Not simply, did this happen exactly as written, but rather, what real events might be hiding inside the story? Because throughout human history, societies have preserved memories of disasters through storytelling. Earthquakes become legends of angry gods. Floods become stories of divine punishment. Volcanic eruptions become tales of fire raining from the sky. And once these events pass into cultural memory, they are retold again and again across generations. Details change, meaning evolves, but the core memory often survives. The plagues of Egypt may fit this pattern. If Egypt experienced a series of environmental disasters, polluted water, animal die-offs, insect outbreaks, crop destruction, and unusual weather events, those events would have been terrifying for people living through them. Ancient Egyptians and Israelites did not have microbiology, meteorology, or environmental science to explain what they were witnessing. Instead, they interpreted the events through religion and divine power. To them, disasters were not random. They were messages from the gods. And this interpretation was not unique to Egypt. Nearly every ancient culture explained catastrophic events through supernatural forces. Storms, droughts, eclipses, and disease outbreaks were often viewed as signs of divine anger or intervention. So if a real environmental crisis struck Egypt and coincided with a political or social upheaval, such as the migration of enslaved populations, those events could easily become intertwined in collective memory. Over time, the disasters might be remembered not simply as natural events, but as a sequence of divine acts leading to the liberation of a people. This does not mean the story is fictional, but it also does not mean the events occurred exactly as written. Instead, it suggests something historians see quite often: real events becoming legendary history. The core experience survives, but the explanation surrounding it changes. And when stories are told for thousands of years, they rarely stay simple. They become powerful narratives filled with symbolism, meaning, and cultural identity, which means the plagues of Egypt might not be just a religious story. They might be a memory of a time when nature itself turned against one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world, and people tried to explain it the only way they knew how. At this point, a very reasonable question appears. If Egypt experienced disasters on the scale described in the plagues, wouldn't Egyptian records mention it? After all, ancient Egypt left behind an enormous amount of written material. Temples, monuments, tomb inscriptions, and papyrus documents describe everything from military campaigns to tax collections. Surely something that dramatic would appear somewhere. But here is where historians encounter a fascinating problem. Ancient Egyptian records were not neutral historical reports. They were political messaging. Pharaohs controlled the official narrative of history, and that narrative had one primary purpose: to demonstrate that the ruler was powerful, favoured by the gods, and fully in control of the kingdom. So the monuments we see today tend to celebrate victories, triumphant battles, successful building projects, foreign enemies defeated, divine blessings received. What we almost never see are official records describing national humiliation or catastrophic failure. You do not find temple carvings that say something like, "Year 12 of Pharaoh's reign, the river failed, insects covered the land, crops were destroyed, and the royal administration had absolutely no idea what was happening." That kind of honesty was not common in royal propaganda. This means that the absence of Egyptian records describing the plagues does not necessarily prove the events never happened. It simply means that official inscriptions were unlikely to record them. However, historians still search for indirect clues. Periods of political instability, evidence of famine, signs of environmental disruption. Occasionally they find hints that Egypt experienced difficult periods during certain centuries, but none of these clues can be definitively connected to the Exodus story, so historians remain cautious. There is no direct archaeological or written evidence proving that the plagues happened exactly as described in the Bible. At the same time, there is also no evidence that definitively disproves the possibility that real disasters inspired the story. And that uncertainty is where historical research often lives. Some questions remain unresolved. The Exodus narrative sits right at the intersection of history, religion, and ancient memory, which means that even after centuries of research, historians still cannot give a simple answer. But the mystery itself is part of what makes the story so enduring, because the plagues of Egypt exist in a strange place between two worlds: faith and history. So after centuries of debate, research, and scientific investigation, where does that leave us? Did the biblical plagues actually happen? The honest answer is, we do not know. There is no clear historical document that confirms the entire sequence of plagues exactly as described in the book of Exodus. No Egyptian monument describing frogs in the palace kitchens or royal scribes complaining about catastrophic insect infestations. But the absence of proof does not automatically mean the story was invented from nothing. History often leaves gaps, especially when the events involve disasters, social upheaval, or the downfall of powerful leaders who preferred their monuments to show victory rather than embarrassment. And when historians examine the plagues closely, something interesting appears. Many of them follow a surprisingly logical pattern. A polluted river could drive animals out of the water. Dead animals could attract insects. Insects could spread disease. Disease could kill livestock and infect people. Storms and locusts could destroy weakened crops. Environmental stress could push an already struggling society toward famine and chaos. In other words, The biblical sequence reads almost like a chain reaction, one crisis triggering the next. Now, that does not prove the plagues happened exactly as written. Ancient writers often shaped stories to convey meaning, morality, and theology. Over generations, real events can grow into powerful narratives filled with symbolism and dramatic detail. But it does suggest something important. The story may contain echoes of real experiences, memories of environmental disasters, political instability, or social upheaval that ancient people struggled to understand. And when humans try to explain frightening events they cannot control, they often turn to the most powerful explanation available: divine intervention. For believers, the plagues remain a powerful example of faith and divine justice. For historians, they remain a fascinating puzzle, a story that may contain fragments of real history hidden beneath layers of storytelling. And that mystery is part of why the plagues of Egypt continue to capture our imagination thousands of years later. Because sometimes history does not give us clear answers. Sometimes it leaves us with questions. And occasionally those questions survive longer than the civilizations that first asked them. A pale April morning settles over the docks of Southampton. The harbour is alive with noise, though not the frantic noise of chaos. Instead, it is the steady rhythm of departure. Porters shout instructions. Steam whistles echo across the water. Somewhere nearby, gulls circle above the masts of smaller ships, complaining loudly as if they disapprove of the enormous newcomer dominating their harbour. You arrive in a carriage that slows beside a long wooden pier. When the door opens and you step out, the first thing you notice is the crowd. Not just passengers, but families, reporters, dock workers, and curious spectators who have come simply to witness the departure of the largest ship ever built. Then you look up, and there it is. The Titanic rises above the harbour like a moving city that has somehow decided to pause for a moment beside the shore. Her black hull stretches so far along the quay that your eyes struggle to take it all in. Above the hull sits a gleaming white superstructure lined with endless rows of windows and promenades. And towering above everything are 4 massive funnels painted in warm buff and black, quietly breathing smoke into the morning air. It is difficult not to stare. Even the dock workers, men who spend their lives around ships, glance upward now and then, as if they still cannot quite believe this vessel is real. A steward in a dark uniform approaches you politely. He tips his hat and checks your ticket. First class. Immediately a porter appears to collect your luggage. He handles your trunks carefully, as if he already knows they will soon be resting inside rooms that resemble those of a grand hotel, rather than a ship crossing the Atlantic. You walk toward the gangway. A small string quartet is playing nearby, the soft music drifting through the cool morning air. It is not loud, just enough to give the moment an atmosphere of calm elegance. Ladies in wide hats move slowly toward the boarding ramp. Gentlemen in tailored coats pause to admire the ship before stepping aboard. And as you reach the foot of the gangway, you realize something. This is not merely a voyage. It feels like the beginning of an experience people will talk about for the rest of their lives. You place one foot on the ramp. Ahead of you waits the most luxurious ship the world has ever seen. The moment you step aboard, the atmosphere changes. Behind you, the docks of Southampton are still loud and busy, filled with shouting porters and curious onlookers. But ahead of you, inside the ship, everything becomes strangely calm. The noise fades, replaced by a quiet order that feels almost ceremonial. A steward greets you immediately. He stands perfectly straight in a dark uniform, white gloves folded neatly behind his back. When he sees your first-class ticket, his expression shifts into a warm and practiced smile. Welcome aboard, sir. Your luggage has already vanished somewhere below deck, taken by porters who seem to know exactly where everything must go. It feels effortless, as though the ship itself has begun to take care of you. You follow the steward inside. The first interior corridor surprises you. Ships, in your mind, are supposed to feel cramped and narrow, but here the hallways are wide and brightly lit. Polished wood panels line the walls, glowing softly beneath electric lights. Thick carpets soften every step. Yes, electric lights. Already the Titanic feels less like a vessel crossing the Atlantic and more like a grand hotel that simply happens to float. The steward leads you toward the heart of the ship. You round a corner and suddenly stop. Before you stands the grand staircase. It rises upward through the decks like the centerpiece of a palace. Carved oak railings curve gracefully around the staircase, and delicate ironwork gleams beneath warm lights. Above it all is a large glass dome, allowing soft daylight to spill down into the room. Passengers stand nearby, simply admiring it. Ladies whisper to one another. Gentlemen tilt their heads upward, studying the details of the carved wood and ornate decorations. Someone quietly remarks that it looks more like the lobby of a luxury hotel in Paris than the interior of a ship. Your steward waits patiently, as though he has seen this reaction many times before. He gestures gently toward the stairs. Your suite is just above. You ascend slowly, your hand gliding along the smooth oak railing. Every step reveals another glimpse of luxury. Velvet chairs rest along the walls. Brass lamps glow warmly. A large clock stands at the landing, its carved figure symbolizing honor and glory crowning time. Everything here is designed to impress. And it works. As you reach the next deck, you begin to understand something. This voyage is not merely about crossing the Atlantic Ocean. It is about doing so in a world of comfort, elegance, and effortless luxury that very few people on Earth will ever experience. At the top of the staircase, the steward guides you along a quiet corridor lined with polished wood and thick carpet that muffles every footstep. The hallway feels less like part of a ship and more like the upper floor of an elegant hotel. Brass lamps glow softly against cream-coloured walls, and the faint scent of fresh polish lingers in the air. Your steward stops before a door. He unlocks it with a small brass key and opens it smoothly. Your suite. You step inside. For a moment, you simply stand there. This is not the cramped cabin you might expect aboard a ship. Instead, the room resembles a private apartment. A sitting room greets you first, furnished with upholstered chairs, a writing desk, and a small table set beside a window. The furniture is polished mahogany, and the cushions are covered in soft fabric that looks as if it belongs in a fine London townhouse. Light pours through the large porthole. Outside, the harbour of Southampton is still busy. Tugboats move slowly beside the giant hull. Dock workers walk along the pier below. Yet from inside this room, the chaos feels distant and quiet. Your luggage has already arrived. The porter has placed your trunks neatly beside the wardrobe. A second door reveals the bedroom, where a comfortable bed waits beneath crisp white sheets. The mattress looks thick and inviting, clearly designed for travellers who expect a proper night's sleep, even while crossing the Atlantic Ocean. There is even something remarkable for a ship. A private bathroom. A small porcelain sink gleams beside polished fixtures, and hot and cold running water are available at the turn of a handle. For many passengers aboard most ships, such conveniences would be unimaginable. But aboard the Titanic, luxury is simply expected. You walk slowly around the suite. A steward appears again to ensure everything meets your expectations. He explains the electric call button near the bed, the heating system that keeps the room warm even in cold Atlantic winds, and the dining schedule for the evening. Tonight's dinner will be served in the first-class dining saloon. Multiple courses, fine china, crystal glasses, the sort of meal one might expect in the finest restaurants of London or Paris. When the steward leaves, the room becomes quiet again. Through the window, you see the dock beginning to grow smaller as the ship prepares to depart. You sit for a moment in the chair beside the window and realise something extraordinary. For the next several days, this floating palace will be your home. After settling into your suite, curiosity quickly pulls you back into the corridors of the ship. Remaining inside such a luxurious room feels almost wasteful when an entire floating city waits to be explored. You make your way toward the promenade deck. The corridor gradually brightens as sunlight filters through large windows. Soon a steward opens a door and a breath of cool sea air greets you. You step outside. The promenade stretches along the side of the ship like a long seaside boulevard. Polished wooden planks run beneath your shoes, perfectly clean and smooth. A white railing separates the deck from the vast harbour beyond. Southampton spreads out behind you. From this height, the docks appear smaller, almost toy-like. Tugboats puff gently beside the Titanic's enormous hull, and crowds still linger along the pier to watch the great liner prepare for departure. Passengers stroll leisurely along the deck. Ladies in elegant dresses walk arm in arm beneath wide hats decorated with ribbons and feathers. Gentlemen wear tailored coats and polished shoes, moving with the relaxed confidence of people who know they are aboard the most luxurious ship ever built. Deck chairs have already been arranged along the railing. Thick blankets are folded neatly across them, ready for passengers who wish to sit and enjoy the ocean air during the voyage. You lean slightly against the rail. The ship is so large that movement is almost impossible to notice. Only the slow shifting of the harbour view tells you that the Titanic is beginning to stir. A deep vibration hums through the deck as the engines come alive far below. It is not loud, just a gentle pulse beneath your feet, like the steady heartbeat of some enormous mechanical creature. Nearby, a small group of musicians begins to play softly. The music drifts across the deck, mixing with the distant sounds of the harbour. It gives the moment a strange sense of ceremony, as though the ship's departure is not simply travel, but an event worthy of quiet celebration. Passengers pause to watch. Some wave toward friends and family on the docks. Others stand silently, simply admiring the scale of the vessel that now carries them toward the Atlantic. The shoreline begins to drift slowly away. Buildings shrink. The pier grows distant. And as the Titanic glides steadily into open water, you begin to feel something remarkable. You are no longer standing in a harbour. You are standing on the deck of the most magnificent ship in the world, beginning a journey across the vast Atlantic Ocean. By evening, the Titanic has settled into the gentle rhythm of the open sea. The distant coast of England has disappeared behind the horizon, leaving only the vast Atlantic stretching endlessly in every direction. A steward delivers a polite reminder to your suite. Dinner will soon be served. You dress carefully. First-class dining aboard the Titanic is not a casual affair. Gentlemen wear evening coats and polished shoes. Ladies appear in elegant gowns that shimmer softly beneath electric light. Even before reaching the dining room, the atmosphere feels more like a grand social event than a simple meal. You make your way down the staircase once again. The ship is alive with quiet activity. Passengers move through the corridors, exchanging greetings and conversation. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of music drifts through the halls. Soon you arrive at the entrance to the first-class dining saloon. Two stewards stand beside the doorway, guiding guests to their assigned tables. When you step inside, the sheer size of the room is almost overwhelming. The dining saloon stretches across a vast portion of the ship, its high ceiling supported by elegant columns painted in soft white. Electric lights glow warmly above, reflecting off polished silverware and crystal glasses arranged across hundreds of tables. White linen covers every surface. The room hums with quiet conversation, the gentle clink of china, and the soft movement of waiters weaving skillfully between the tables. You are guided to your seat. Almost immediately, a waiter appears with the first course. The meal is elaborate, carefully planned and served with the precision of a fine European restaurant. The menu includes delicacies few ships would even attempt to serve at sea. Fresh oysters, rich soups, perfectly prepared fish and roasted meats. Each course arrives beautifully presented on fine china bearing the emblem of the White Star Line. Crystal glasses catch the light as wine is poured. Around you, conversations flow easily. Wealthy businessmen discuss investments. Aristocrats speak of London and Paris. Travellers bound for New York share their plans for the weeks ahead. It is easy to forget that you are hundreds of miles from land. Everything about this room is designed to create the illusion of stability, elegance, and effortless comfort. Course follows course, each more impressive than the last. And as the final plates are cleared and dessert arrives beneath the glow of electric chandeliers, one thought becomes impossible to ignore. No ship in history has ever offered an experience quite like this. Dinner ends slowly, the final plates cleared while waiters glide quietly between the tables like practiced dancers. Guests rise one by one, adjusting coats and gowns, continuing conversations as they drift out of the dining saloon. But the evening aboard the Titanic is far from over. A steward suggests the first-class lounge. You follow the gentle flow of passengers down a corridor and soon arrive at another remarkable room. The lounge feels warm and inviting, designed not for spectacle like the dining saloon, but for comfort and conversation. Large windows line the walls, though now they reveal only darkness outside. The Atlantic stretches endlessly beyond the glass, invisible except for the occasional glimmer of moonlight on the waves. Inside, however, the atmosphere is lively. Comfortable armchairs and small tables fill the room. Gentlemen sit together discussing business ventures and politics, while ladies gather nearby exchanging stories of London society and upcoming seasons in New York. A pianist plays softly in the corner. The music is calm, elegant, and perfectly suited to the quiet luxury of the room. It blends with the murmur of conversation, creating a soothing background that makes time seem to slow. A steward offers you a drink. Crystal glasses appear on silver trays, filled with fine wines and spirits. Cigars are available for those who wish to enjoy them in the designated smoking areas of the ship. You settle into one of the deep chairs. The upholstery is thick and comfortable, and the warmth of the room contrasts pleasantly with the cool ocean air you felt earlier on the promenade deck. Passengers around you seem perfectly at ease. It is easy to see why. The Titanic has been designed to remove every inconvenience from the experience of ocean travel. There is no rocking discomfort, no cramped quarters, no sense of danger. Instead, there is quiet elegance. Across the room, a group of passengers begins discussing the ship itself. They admire the engineering that makes such a voyage possible. Some speak confidently about the Titanic's advanced safety features. Many repeat the same phrase with a tone of admiration. The ship is practically unsinkable. The idea spreads through the room like a comforting certainty. After all, with her size, her steel construction, and her modern design, what danger could possibly threaten such a vessel? The pianist continues to play, and as the evening drifts peacefully onward, no one in the lounge can imagine that history will soon prove those confident words tragically wrong. Eventually the lounge begins to quiet. Some passengers return to their suites, others move toward the smoking room or remain seated in conversation. unwilling to let such a pleasant evening end too quickly. But you feel drawn back toward the open air. You step out into the corridor and follow the familiar path toward the promenade deck. When the door opens, the cool Atlantic night greets you. The change from the warm interior of the ship is immediate. A fresh breeze moves across the deck, carrying the clean scent of the open ocean. The sounds inside the ship fade behind you, replaced by the steady hush of water moving along the Titanic's hull. Night has completely fallen. Above you stretches a sky filled with stars so bright and numerous that they almost seem unreal. Far from the lights of cities, the heavens reveal themselves with remarkable clarity. The Milky Way forms a faint glowing band across the darkness, and countless stars shimmer like scattered diamonds. The ocean below mirrors that silence. You walk slowly along the deck. Only a few other passengers are outside now. A couple leans quietly against the railing, speaking in soft voices. Farther down the deck, a gentleman sits alone in a deck chair, wrapped in a blanket, while gazing at the sky. The Titanic moves forward with calm confidence. The engines produce a deep, steady vibration beneath the deck, barely noticeable but reassuring in its rhythm. Every few seconds the bow cuts through the water ahead, sending soft ripples outward into the dark Atlantic. You rest your hands on the railing. From here the ship's immense size becomes clear. The promenade stretches far ahead and behind you, disappearing into shadows beneath electric deck lamps. Somewhere forward near the bow, the sea breaks gently against the hull as the Titanic pushes onward across the vast ocean. It feels peaceful. The ship seems unstoppable. With its immense size and modern engineering, it moves through the water with a quiet strength that inspires complete confidence. Passengers aboard speak often about the same thing. This vessel is the greatest achievement of modern travel. You remain there for several minutes, breathing in the cold ocean air and watching the stars drift slowly across the sky. Finally, you turn back toward the warmth of the ship. Tomorrow will bring another day of comfort, exploration, and luxury aboard the most magnificent liner ever built. And tonight, the Atlantic appears calm, endless, and perfectly safe. Morning arrives quietly aboard the Titanic. You wake slowly, noticing first the gentle stillness of the room. There is no harsh rocking, no sudden noises that might remind you that you are far out at sea. Instead, the ship moves with such smooth confidence that the sensation is almost like resting in a grand hotel that simply happens to glide across the ocean. A soft knock comes at the door. Your steward enters politely carrying a breakfast tray. Silver dishes rest neatly upon it, and steam rises from a pot of fresh tea. Toast, eggs, and fruit have been prepared with the same careful attention you saw at last night's dinner. Even breakfast here feels luxurious. You thank the steward, and after he leaves, you open the curtains beside the window. Sunlight floods the suite. Outside, the Atlantic stretches endlessly in every direction. The water is calm, its surface gently rolling beneath the pale morning sky. There is no land in sight, only the faint white wake trailing behind the Titanic as she continues steadily westward. You dress and step out into the corridor. The ship is already alive with activity. First-class passengers move through the halls with relaxed confidence, as if this floating palace has become completely familiar overnight. Some are heading toward the dining saloon for breakfast. Others are already making their way to the promenade deck to enjoy the fresh morning air. You follow them outside. The sunlight transforms the ship. Yesterday's quiet elegance now feels brighter and more lively. Deck chairs are arranged along the railing, many already occupied by passengers reading newspapers or sipping coffee, while wrapped comfortably in blankets. The sea sparkles in the distance. A steward walks past carrying a tray of warm drinks. Somewhere nearby, a small group of passengers discusses the remarkable speed of the Titanic. Despite her immense size, she crosses the Atlantic with impressive efficiency. Yet there is no rush. Passengers stroll slowly along the deck, enjoying the peaceful rhythm of life aboard the ship. Some talk about the ports they have visited in Europe. Others speak excitedly about the arrival in New York that awaits them in just a few days. Everything feels safe, controlled, and perfectly planned. The Titanic continues forward across the Atlantic with quiet power. And standing there in the morning sunlight, surrounded by comfort and calm, it is impossible to imagine that anything could interrupt such a magnificent voyage. The day drifts by with the gentle rhythm that seems to define life aboard the Titanic. Hours pass almost unnoticed. Passengers stroll the decks, read in the lounges, and gather for meals that feel more like elegant social events than simple necessities. By evening, the Atlantic sky begins to darken once again. You return to the promenade after dinner, drawn by the quiet beauty of the open ocean at night. The air has grown colder since morning, and the breeze carries a sharper edge as it moves across the deck. Stewards have already placed blankets over the deck chairs, anticipating passengers who wish to linger outside beneath the stars. The ship moves forward with steady confidence. Far below, the engines continue their quiet, powerful rhythm. The vibration beneath your feet is faint but constant, a reminder that the Titanic is pushing forward across the vast ocean at remarkable speed. Above you, the sky is perfectly clear. The stars appear even brighter than the night before. Without clouds or moonlight to soften them, they glitter with an almost eerie sharpness. The ocean below reflects nothing but darkness, a deep black expanse stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Passengers move calmly along the deck. Some walk slowly, enjoying the fresh air before returning inside. Others lean quietly against the railings, watching the sea glide past the hull of the ship. Laughter and conversation drift through the cool night air. From somewhere inside the ship, faint music can still be heard. The Titanic feels invincible. That thought seems to hang quietly in the air. With her massive steel hull, advanced engineering, and luxurious design, she represents the peak of human achievement. Many passengers speak of her with pride, confident they are travelling aboard the safest vessel ever constructed. Yet the ocean remains vast and silent. You stand at the railing for a moment longer, watching the dark water rush past the bow. The night feels peaceful, almost hypnotic, as the ship cuts steadily through the Atlantic. Eventually you turn back toward the warm lights of the ship's interior. Tomorrow will bring another day of comfort, conversation, and elegance aboard the most famous liner in the world. And as the Titanic continues her journey westward through the calm, star-filled night, no one aboard can yet imagine how suddenly this perfect voyage will change. The year is 1920. Only a few years earlier, the world had been trapped in one of the darkest conflicts in human history. The First World War had scarred continents, shattered empires, and left entire generations carrying the weight of loss. Cities across Europe were still rebuilding, and millions of families were learning to live with the quiet absence of fathers, sons, and brothers who would never return. For a moment, it seemed as though the world might sink into a long era of exhaustion. But something unexpected happened. Instead of retreating into silence and caution, society erupted with energy. Across the United States and Europe, people felt an almost urgent desire to live again. After years of rationing, fear, and discipline, the appetite for pleasure returned with incredible force. Restaurants filled, music halls reopened. Dance floors came alive with laughter and movement. It was as if the world had collectively decided that life was simply too short to waste. New technologies began to transform daily life. Automobiles rolled off factory lines in growing numbers, allowing ordinary people to travel farther than ever before. Radios appeared in living rooms, bringing music and news directly into homes. Electric lights illuminated city streets late into the night, turning urban centres into glowing landscapes of possibility. Wealth also seemed to expand at astonishing speed. The stock market climbed higher year after year, and investors spoke confidently about a future of endless prosperity. Businessmen made fortunes in industries that had barely existed a decade earlier. Suddenly there were more millionaires than ever before, and with wealth came extravagance. Grand hotels filled with champagne and laughter. Private clubs hosted lavish parties that lasted until sunrise. The upper classes dressed in silk and pearls, while orchestras played energetic new rhythms that encouraged people to dance without restraint. In many ways, the spirit of this new decade echoed something familiar. Only 8 years earlier, the Titanic had represented the peak of luxury and confidence in the modern world. That floating palace symbolized a belief that progress and wealth could build a perfect future. The 1920s carried that same spirit, but now it had spread across entire cities. The world seemed convinced that a brilliant new age had arrived, an era of glamour, music, and endless celebration. Few people stopped to wonder how long such a dazzling moment could truly last. As the 1920s gathered momentum, the great cities of the world began to transform. Places that had once grown quiet after sunset now seemed determined to remain awake all night. Electric lights spilled from theatre marquees, restaurant windows, and hotel lobbies, turning city streets into glowing rivers of movement and noise. New York was perhaps the most dramatic example. Broadway blazed with bright signs and crowded sidewalks. Taxi horns echoed through Manhattan while crowds poured in and out of music halls, dance clubs, and rooftop restaurants. The city had always been lively, but now it felt almost unstoppable. Paris was no different. Cafes spilled out onto the sidewalks where artists, writers, and musicians gathered late into the night. The sound of laughter mixed with the rhythm of jazz drifting from small clubs hidden in narrow streets. The city that had survived war and hardship suddenly rediscovered its appetite for beauty and celebration. Berlin, too, pulsed with life. The German capital became famous for its daring nightlife. Cabarets hosted performances that were bold, artistic, and sometimes scandalous. Visitors described Berlin as a place where the rules of society seemed to loosen after dark. The world's cities had become stages, and people were eager to perform. Fashion changed quickly to match this new atmosphere. Men wore sleek suits and polished shoes, projecting the confidence of businessmen in a booming economy. Women began to reject the heavy clothing of earlier decades, choosing lighter dresses that allowed them to move freely on the dance floor. Short haircuts became fashionable. The new generation of young women, often called flappers, embraced independence with striking confidence. They danced, smoked, and spoke openly in ways that shocked the older generation. Music filled the air. Jazz spread rapidly through clubs and theatres, bringing new rhythms that encouraged people to move with energy and spontaneity. Trumpets, pianos, and saxophones replaced the restrained orchestras of earlier years. Dancing became faster, louder, and far more exciting. In many ways, the atmosphere of the 1920s resembled a permanent celebration. The world had endured tragedy, and now people were determined to make up for lost time. Every night seemed like an opportunity to experience something extraordinary. Cities had become playgrounds of light, music, and motion, and for those living through it, the future appeared brighter than ever before. If the cities of the 1920s had a heartbeat, it was jazz. The music seemed to arrive everywhere at once, spilling out of clubs, dance halls, and radios with a rhythm that felt entirely new. Unlike the form